My name is Claire, I'm 38 years old, and I found out exactly what my mother thought of me the morning her attorney read her will out loud in a room that smelled like old wood and coffee nobody had touched. She left everything to my brother. Not because she forgot me, not because she made a mistake. The attorney cleared his throat and read a single typewritten line that my mother had apparently dictated herself, and that line said, "Claire has always been provided for." That was the explanation. 7 words and a lifetime of silence underneath them. 3 weeks later, my father's attorney called. Not to offer condolences, not to ask how I was holding up. She called because my father, who had been dead for 11 years, had apparently left something behind that my mother spent over a decade making sure I never found out about. What I learned in that phone call rearranged every story I had ever told myself about my family. And what I did with it is the reason you're here. Let me tell you who I was before that attorney's office, because it explains everything that came after. I grew up in a 4-bedroom colonial in Westfield, New Jersey, the kind of house that looks like the cover of a real estate brochure from the outside and feels like a waiting room on the inside. My parents were Gerald and Miriam Voss. My father was an engineer who built his own small firm from nothing and ran it quietly and well for 30 years. My mother was a woman who had strong opinions about table settings and stronger opinions about which of her 2 children had more potential. My brother's name is Nolan. He's 4 years younger than me, and from the time he was old enough to hold a lacrosse stick, he was the project, the investment, the one my mother introduced first at parties, described in the most detail, and defended most fiercely whenever anyone questioned anything about him. I don't say this with bitterness anymore. I've done enough work on myself to say it plainly. Nolan was the favorite, and in our house, that was not a subtle thing. I was not neglected in any material sense. I had clothes and school supplies and a college fund that covered a state school. What I didn't have was the particular warmth my mother reserved for my brother. The way she laughed at his jokes first. The way she called him on Tuesday afternoons for no reason while I got Christmas and birthdays, and even then, sometimes just a card. The way she described her family to strangers at the grocery store, at church, at the neighborhood association, meetings my father quietly dreaded. "My son Nolan is at Columbia," she would say. "He's going to be an attorney." And then, if the conversation continued long enough, "I have a daughter too. She's very independent." I was very independent. That was the phrase she used for me the way other mothers used words like accomplished or driven. Independent meant, essentially, that I had stopped needing things from her, which was true. I had. Because needing things from her had, by the time I was 16, begun to feel like dropping coins into a machine that was permanently out of order. My father understood this in the way quiet men sometimes understand things they can't say out loud in their own houses. He would find me in the kitchen late at night when I was studying, and he'd make 2 cups of tea without asking and set one in front of me and sit down. We didn't always talk. Sometimes we just sat. But he saw me in a way my mother never bothered to, and I have loved him for that every day of my life, including every day since he died. Gerald Voss died of a sudden cardiac event on a Tuesday morning in March, 11 years ago. He was 61. He was at his office. His assistant found him. He had apparently been at his desk since 7, which was not unusual, and had been gone for at least an hour before anyone realized. That detail still gets me, that he was alone, that the last hour of his life happened without anyone knowing. I flew home from Chicago, where I had been living for 3 years by then, building a career in financial planning that my mother considered serviceable at best. I sat in the front row at the funeral and held my mother's arm and made sure the caterers for the reception had enough of the smoked salmon she'd specified, because even in grief she had specifications, and I absorbed the logistics of a death the way I had always absorbed the logistics of our family. I handled things. I made the phone calls. I sorted the paperwork. And then I went back to Chicago, and I built my life, and I called my mother on Sundays, and I visited at Thanksgiving and sometimes Christmas, and I sent birthday cards that I wrote actual messages in, not just my name. And I watched from a medium distance as my brother took up more and more of the space in my mother's life, and my mother took up more and more of the space in Nolan's. Until the 2 of them had formed a closed circuit that I orbited around without ever quite being let inside. This went on for 11 years. 11 years of Sunday phone calls and holiday visits, and the particular low-grade ache of being on the outside of your own family, pressing your palm against the glass. And then Miriam Voss had a stroke on a Thursday in February, and died 4 days later without regaining consciousness, and I flew home again, and this time there was no one whose arm I needed to hold. The attorney's name was Douglas Hecht, and his office was in the kind of building downtown Westfield that has leather chairs and framed diplomas and a receptionist who speaks very softly, as if the whole building is in mourning as a permanent state. Nolan was already there when I arrived. He was wearing a blazer, which I noted, because Nolan did not typically wear blazers on Thursday mornings unless he wanted to look like the kind of person who wore blazers. He did not make eye contact when I came in. He poured himself a coffee from the sideboard and looked at the framed diplomas on the wall with great interest. I sat down. The receptionist brought water. Douglas Hecht came in and shook both our hands and expressed condolences with the practiced warmth of a man who had expressed condolences many times and had learned to make it feel personal without expending any of his own actual feeling. He sat down. He opened a folder. The will was not long. My mother had apparently been very clear about what she wanted, which was consistent with who she was as a person. She left the house to Nolan. She left the investment accounts to Nolan. She left the jewelry, the furniture, the car, the remaining balance in her checking account, and a collection of first edition books she'd inherited from her own mother, to Nolan. She left a single piece to me, a watercolor painting of a lighthouse that had hung in the upstairs hallway my entire childhood. I had never once expressed any particular attachment to this painting. It was simply the thing she had decided I should have. Douglas Hecht read the explanatory note. Claire has always been provided for. The room was quiet for a moment after he said it. Nolan looked at the table. I looked at Douglas Hecht. Douglas Hecht looked at his folder. I asked if the will had been drafted recently. He told me it had been updated 14 months ago, which meant my mother had done this with full cognition and no particular crisis prompting the decision. She had simply decided, on some ordinary afternoon 14 months ago, that this was the shape of things. I said thank you. I shook Douglas Hecht's hand. I walked to the parking lot and sat in my rental car and looked at the steering wheel for a very long time. The painting of the lighthouse was already in the trunk. Nolan had brought it from the house that morning, wrapped in a garbage bag. He hadn't offered to help me carry it. I want to stop here and tell you something true, because I think it matters for the rest of the story. I was not surprised. That's the part that broke me more than the will itself. I sat in that parking lot and the tears came, but they weren't the tears of someone who had been blindsided. They were the tears of someone who had known for a very long time and had spent years talking herself out of the knowing. There is a particular kind of grief that comes from having your worst suspicion confirmed. It's not the sharp grief of sudden loss. It's the slow grief of finally being allowed to stop hopping. And in a terrible way, there is relief in it. The wondering is over. The wondering is the worst part. I had wondered my whole life whether I was reading my family wrong. Whether my mother's preference for Nolan was something I had inflated in my own mind, the way hurt people sometimes do. Whether I was being uncharitable. Whether if I just called more, visited more, asked for less, explained myself differently, eventually the warmth would come. The will was the answer to that wondering. Final and official and witnessed by two people whose names I didn't know. She had not forgotten to include me. She had thought about it, perhaps even specifically, and decided to put in writing that I had always been provided for, and by that she meant, I think, that I had provided for myself, and she had chosen to call that proof that I didn't need her. My independence, that word she'd used my whole life, had apparently become her justification. I had never needed her, therefore she owed me nothing. The fact that I had not needed her, because needing her had never worked, was not something the will addressed. I drove back to the hotel and I ordered room service, and I called my friend Deborah in Chicago, who has known me for 15 years and is constitutionally incapable of sugarcoating anything, and I told her what happened. She was quiet for a long moment, and then she said, "Claire, I want you to do something before you fly home. She said, I want you to call your father's old firm. I asked her why. She said, because I have always thought there was something your mother didn't tell you, and I think now is the time to find out. Deborah is perceptive in the way that people who love you without needing anything from you tend to be perceptive. She sees me without agenda. I asked her what made her say that, and she said something I've turned over in my mind many times since. Because your father saw you, she said. He really saw you. And men like that don't leave their daughters with nothing, not on purpose. I lay awake that night and thought about my father, about the late-night kitchen tea, about the quiet way he had of sitting with me in the hard moments without trying to fix them, about the way he had looked at me across the room at Nolan's law school graduation, when my mother was turned fully toward Nolan and hadn't noticed me standing slightly to the left of her, and my father had caught my eye and given me a small, level nod that said, I see you. I'm sorry. You matter. He had been gone 11 years, and I still missed him with a physical weight. The next morning, I called the firm. Gerald Voss had retired the firm upon his death, as he had no partner to leave it to and no children who had gone into engineering. The firm's assets had been sold, and the office had been absorbed by a larger company. But my father had used an estate attorney separately from any business dealings, a woman named Patricia Ackafer, who had apparently maintained a file on my father's behalf for 11 years, and who had made 2 previous attempts to contact me, both of which, I would later understand, had been intercepted. Patricia Ackafer's voice on the phone was measured and professional with a warmth underneath it that suggested she was relieved to be talking to me. She asked me to confirm my full name, my date of birth, and my mother's name. Then she paused for a moment, the kind of pause that precedes something significant. She said, Ms. Voss, your father established a trust in your name 11 years ago, 3 months before he died. The room went very still. She continued, he had been diagnosed with a heart condition 8 months prior to his death. He didn't share this with the family broadly, but he used the time it gave him to put certain things in order. One of those things was ensuring that a portion of the firm's assets, upon liquidation, would be held in trust for you. Your father specified that the trust was to be disclosed to you at the time of your mother's death, or at age 40, whichever came first. I asked her why he had waited, why he had structured it that way. She chose her words carefully. He told me in our final meeting that he was concerned the information might create conflict in the family while your mother was living. He wanted you protected without it becoming a source of pain during his wife's lifetime. I understood this. It was so completely my father. He had seen the shape of things with clear eyes and tried to engineer a kindness around it that wouldn't cost anyone else. He had known his wife. He had known his family. And he had quietly, without telling anyone, including me, made sure that what he saw in me was honored in the only way left to him. Patricia Ackafer told me the trust contained a sum that I will not state in full here, because the number is not the point, but I will tell you that it was significant. More than significant. It was the kind of number that comes from a man who had spent 30 years building something carefully and had decided at the end of his life where the most important piece of it should go. She had tried to contact me twice. The first time, 2 years after my father's death, a letter had been sent to the house in Westfield, addressed to me. The second time, 5 years after that, a certified letter had gone to the same address, because I had not, at that point, filed a formal address change with the estate. Both letters, Patricia told me, had been signed for by a resident of the house. She read me the signature. It was my mother's. Miriam Voss had signed for both letters. She had known about the trust for 9 years, and she had said nothing to me, to Nolan, or to anyone I was aware of. She had simply kept it, the way she kept other things she considered inconvenient, in a place where it couldn't disturb the story she preferred. I sat with the phone against my ear for a long moment after Patricia finished speaking. "Are you all right?" she asked. It was a genuine question. She had waited 11 years for this conversation, and I suspected she had feelings about it that she was professionally containing. I told her I was, and then I asked her the question that had been forming since she said the word trust. "Did my father leave a letter?" She said yes, he did. The letter was 3 pages, handwritten on the kind of yellow legal paper my father had kept in every desk he'd ever owned. Patricia had scanned it years ago and kept the digital file as a backup, and she emailed it to me that afternoon while I sat on the hotel bed with the lighthouse painting leaning against the wall across from me, still in its garbage bag. I am not going to read you the full letter. Some things are not for the world, but I will tell you what was in it because it's the hinge the whole story swings on. My father wrote that he had watched me my entire life and had never stopped being proud of what he saw. He wrote that he knew I had felt the difference in how I was treated, and that he had not handled it well, and that he was sorry. He wrote that he had told my mother more than once that what she did, the coldness, the preference, the particular way she made me invisible was wrong. He wrote that she had not agreed, and that he had, to his shame, stopped pushing. He wrote, I chose peace over my own daughter too many times. I will carry that. He wrote that the trust was not a consolation prize. It was his attempt to say, with the only language that couldn't be argued with or withheld or intercepted, that he had always known exactly who I was, and that he considered me the most like him of anyone in his life, and that he was grateful I had existed. He wrote at the end, in handwriting that was slightly less even than the rest, as if he had been tired, You were never the difficult one, Claire. You were the honest one. In this family, that looked the same. It wasn't. I read it 4 times. Then I set my phone face down on the bed and looked at the ceiling and breathed the way you breathe when something that has been pressing on your chest for 30 years finally lifts. My father had seen me. He had seen me and written it down in legal ink and made sure someone would hold it until I was allowed to have it. And my mother had known and said nothing, and instead, 14 months ago, sat down with her own attorney and written a single line about how I had always been provided for, which was true, and which she had intended as a dismissal, but which was, it turned out, more true than she had known. I had been provided for, by my father, in a letter and a trust that she had tried to make disappear and had almost succeeded. I called Deborah. She picked up on the first ring, I told her. There was a silence on the line, and then she said, in a voice that was very careful and very kind, What are you going to do? I looked at the lighthouse, painting in the garbage bag. I'm going to make some calls, I said, and then I'm going to let Nalan read something. Let me tell you about my brother before you decide how to feel about what came next. Nalan is not a cruel person. He is not calculating or scheming or villainous. He is something that is in some ways harder to navigate, which is a person who has been told he is exceptional for so long that he has come to experience the world entirely through that lens. He is generous with people he considers peers. He is warm with people he considers beneath him in need of his help. But he has never, in my adult memory, considered that the people around him might be carrying things he isn't aware of, because the whole architecture of his upbringing was built on the assumption that the important things in the family were things that revolved around him. He did not know, as far as I was aware, that my mother had blocked contact from my father's estate attorney. He did not know about the trust. He did not know that the letters had been signed for and quietly buried. He had simply grown up in a house where my mother provided the narrative, and the narrative was that Claire was independent and fine and didn't need much, and he had never had any particular reason to question it. This did not entirely excuse him. He had also not particularly tried to know. But there is a difference between the person who builds the lie and the person who never looks behind the wall to see if there's something there. Nalan had never looked. That was his failure, but the construction was my mother's. I decided, before I did anything else, to tell him directly, not as a move, not as an opening in a negotiation, because he was my brother and he had a right to understand what had actually happened in his own family, and because if I had learned anything from my father's letter, it was that the cost of choosing silence over honesty gets charged eventually. I didn't want to pay that bill at 60. I called him the evening after I spoke with Patricia Ockeffer. He picked up after 2 rings, which surprised me. We didn't typically call each other. I told him I had spoken with Dad's estate attorney. He went quiet. I told him about the trust. I told him about the letter. I told him about the 2 certified letters that had been sent to the house and signed for by our mother. I read him one sentence from the letter, the one about choosing peace over his own daughter, because it was the one he needed to hear. The silence that followed was different from Nolan's usual silences. His usual silences were the comfortable silences of someone who isn't particularly paying attention. This one had weight. He said, "Mom signed for them." I said yes. He said both times. I said yes. He said nothing for a long moment. I heard him breathing. I heard something in the background, a television or music, cut suddenly to quiet. He had turned it off. "I didn't know," he said. I told him I believed him. "Claire," he said, and then stopped. "Tried again. I never thought about, I knew you weren't close with her. I didn't think about why." I said that was something to think about now. He asked what I was going to do. I told him I was going to work with Patricia to access the trust, which was entirely straightforward and legal and required nothing from him. I told him I wasn't contesting the will. I wasn't interested in the house or the investment accounts or the first edition books. I told him I was going to take the lighthouse painting out of the garbage bag and hang it somewhere it could be seen properly, and that the rest I was still deciding. He said that's fair. Then he said, "I'm sorry. I should have, paid more attention." It wasn't a speech. It wasn't a grand apology. But it was honest, and from Nolan that was not nothing. He had not learned honesty easily. It had not been modeled for him. I told him I'd be in touch. I hung up and sat quietly for a while. The question Deborah had asked me was still sitting open. What are you going to do? I want to be precise about what I was feeling in those days, because I think it matters, and because people often get this part wrong when they tell this kind of story. What I felt was not rage. It had looked like rage might be coming, in the attorney's office in the parking lot, reading the letter on the hotel bed. But what it actually was, when I sat still with it, was something colder and more clarifying. I felt, for the first time in a very long time, entirely clear. My mother had spent 30 years telling a story about her family in which I was a minor character who required nothing and contributed nothing that couldn't be easily replaced. She had signed for letters that would have changed my life and buried them in whatever place people bury the things they'd rather not confront. She had put in her own will a single dismissive line that she intended as a closing statement on the question of what she owed me. And then she had died without ever having to hear what any of that had cost. I could not change that. She was gone. The confrontation I might have once imagined, the one in the dining room, the documents on the table, the moment where the story cracked in front of an audience, was not available to me. The woman who owed me an accounting was not in a position to give one. What I had instead was a letter from my father, and a trust he had built, and a truth that had waited 11 years to reach me. And I had a choice about what to do with all of it. I thought about my father's words, "You were the honest one." In this family, that looked the same. I thought about the life I had built in Chicago, the career, the apartment with good light that I had chosen because I liked the way the afternoon came through the west windows, the clients who trusted me with their financial futures because I was careful and clear-eyed and never told them what they wanted to hear if what they wanted to hear wasn't true. I thought about all the years I had spent managing my own needs down to a size that wouldn't bother anyone. The way you learn to take up less space in a room where you've been told repeatedly that you're slightly too much. And I decided that what I was going to do was not revenge. It was something simpler and harder than revenge. I was going to stop being small. There were practical things to handle first, because there always are, and I am good at practical things. That is perhaps the most genuine thing my mother ever said about me. I am good at practical things. Patricia Ackafer and I met in person the following week. She was exactly what I had expected from her voice, precise, warm, quietly formidable. She had a framed photograph on her desk of herself and a group of women at what appeared to be a hiking trail, everyone grinning, and I liked her immediately. She walked me through the trust documentation with thoroughness and patience. I asked good questions. She gave complete answers. The process of formally accessing the trust took 6 weeks. There were forms and verifications, and the particular slow, bureaucratic rhythm of legal and financial procedures, which I understand from the inside out, and which did not frustrate me the way it might frustrate someone less familiar with how these things move. I had done this kind of work for clients for years. Now I was doing it for myself, which felt both strange and oddly right, like finally applying to yourself the same care you've spent years applying to others. During those 6 weeks, I went back to Chicago and back to work and back to my apartment with the west-facing windows, and I tried to be precise about what had changed and what hadn't. What hadn't changed, my brother's fundamental limitations, my mother's permanent absence, the years that had happened the way they happened. What had changed, the story, not the facts of it, but the meaning. My father's letter had not altered the events of my childhood. It had altered the interpretation. I had spent 30 years believing, on some low, quiet level, that the way my mother treated me was a reflection of something true about me, some deficit, some way in which I was genuinely less. The letter said, in my father's own handwriting, that this was not the case, that the story my mother told was not the true one. That the person who had seen me, most clearly, had seen something worth honoring. That is the specific thing a parent's letter can do that nothing else can. It is not money. It is the record. I had the record now, and I found, as the weeks passed, that it was changing my posture in ways I hadn't anticipated. I stood up straighter in meetings. I stopped apologizing at the beginning of sentences. I called my brother once, briefly, to check in, and he answered, and we talked for 20 minutes about nothing in particular, and it was the easiest conversation we had ever had because, for the first time, neither of us was performing anything. There was one more piece I need to tell you about, because this is the piece that took the longest to find its right shape. My mother had a close friend named Sylvia Barron. They had been friends for 40 years, since before I was born. Sylvia had been at my mother's funeral, had brought the appropriate food to the reception, had held my mother's arm at the cemetery with a grief that was genuine and deep, and which I respected. Sylvia had known my family my entire life, which meant that Sylvia had, presumably, known the version of me that my mother narrated. I had not spent much time with Sylvia. She was my mother's friend, not mine, but she called me 6 weeks after the funeral on a Sunday afternoon. I almost didn't pick up. I'm glad I did. She said she'd been thinking about me. She said she had something she wanted to say, and that she'd been deciding for weeks whether to say it, and that she had finally decided she would feel worse not saying it than saying it. She told me that my mother had talked about me, not in the way I might expect, not warmly, not with the particular mother pride that Sylvia had told me my mother reserved for Nolan, but she had talked about me. She had said more than once over the years that Claire was the one who got away, not in anger. In something closer, Sylvia told me, to a kind of helpless sadness. That girl never needed me, Miriam had apparently said. Right from the beginning, she was born not needing me. I let this sit. Sylvia said, and I could hear that she was being careful, I don't think your mother knew what to do with someone who reminded her of herself at her worst. You were competent the way she wanted to be and never quite was. And I think that scared her more than she ever let herself understand. I asked Sylvia if she had known about the trust. She hadn't. She was quiet for a moment when I told her, then said, simply, your father loved you very much. He never said so directly, but it was obvious to anyone who watched the two of you. I asked if she thought my mother had known she was wrong. Sylvia was quiet for longer this time. Then she said, I think she knew. I think that's why she said what she said in the will. She was trying to make it reasonable after the fact. That's what she did. She made things reasonable after the fact. This is the conversation that allowed me to grieve my mother correctly, not as the villain of my story. As a woman who had her own limitations and her own fears, and who had spent her life making them reasonable after the fact, which is a very human thing to do, and a very destructive thing to do, and which I was, I realized, also prone to. The difference was that I had a father's letter telling me to stop. The trust was released on a Thursday morning in April. Patricia emailed me the confirmation, and I read it at my desk with a cup of coffee, and then I closed my email and worked until noon and walked to the restaurant around the corner and ordered the thing I actually wanted instead of the cheaper thing I'd told myself was fine. I sat at a table by the window and ate slowly and looked at the street, and I tried to identify what I felt. What I felt was settled. Not happy exactly, though I was not unhappy. Not triumphant, though something had undeniably resolved. Settled was the right word. The way a building settles when it's finally on a true foundation after years of everything being slightly off level. My father had seen me and left a record of it. My mother had tried to bury the record, and she had almost succeeded, but she hadn't, and now the record was mine. It could not be contested. It could not be intercepted. It could not be dismissed with 7 words in a typewritten will. It existed. He had existed. And I existed, specifically in his eyes, in the way he'd seen me. That was what the money was. Not money, a record. I left a generous tip and walked back to the office in the April afternoon sun and felt, for the first time I could specifically locate, like myself. Here is how it's settled, because I know you want to know. Nolan and I are not close, but we are in contact in a real way now, which is new. He calls sometimes, not often, but more than before. He asks questions about my life that he didn't used to ask. He's learned that asking is possible, I think, from discovering that the story he'd been given was incomplete. Incomplete stories, when you find out they're incomplete, tend to make people more curious than they were before. I don't know if we'll ever be the kind of siblings who vacation together or have easy shorthand or call each other just to check in on a random Wednesday. But we are the kind of siblings who tell each other the truth now. That is not nothing. That is actually quite a lot. The house in Westfield sold. Nolan handled the sale, and it was clean and quick, the way house sales are when nobody is fighting about them. I did not want the house. I had not wanted it when it was possible I might want it, and I did not want it after. The house was never mine in the way that mattered. The tea in the kitchen was, and the late-night quiet, and the nod across the room at the graduation, and those things didn't require a deed. I used a portion of the trust to do something my father would have considered eminently practical. I invested it properly. I do this for a living, and I am good at it. Some I set aside for things I had told myself for years I couldn't afford and could, in fact, afford. I just hadn't believed I was allowed to have them. A trip to Portugal I had been almost planning for 6 years. A piece of furniture for the apartment that I'd admired and walked past 14 times. Small things. Permission things. The rest I have been thinking about in the context of something my father wrote near the end of the letter. Use it to do something that lasts. You'll know what that looks like when you see it. I'm still working out the right shape for that. I'm in no particular hurry. My father waited 11 years to tell me. The least I can do is take the time to get it right. Patricia Ackafer and I had lunch last month. It wasn't a business lunch. The legal part of our relationship had concluded. It was just lunch. She told me that out of the estates she had managed, my father's was the one that stayed with her the longest, and not because of its complexity, because of the care in it. She said he had asked in their final meeting whether she thought the trust would reach me. She had told him she believed it would. He had said, good. She earned it. He hadn't meant financially. She was sure of that. He had meant something else entirely. I carry that the way I imagine he carried the worry about whether I'd find out. Lightly, and in a place close to the chest, and every day. Deborah came to visit in May. We sat on my kitchen floor with wine at 10 o'clock on a Thursday, which is something we do periodically, and which I consider one of the better things about being an adult with no one to report to. And I told her the whole thing from beginning to end, the way I've told it to you now. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment in the way she's quiet when she's actually thinking, and not just waiting to talk. Then she said, "Your dad knew you'd be okay." I asked her what she meant. She said, "He didn't leave you the trust because he thought you couldn't survive without it. He left it because he wanted you to know he'd been paying attention. The money was just the medium. It was the only way he could say it from where he was." I looked at the kitchen light and thought about that. She was right. He had spent his life as a man who built things with precision and intention, and who communicated best in structures rather than declarations. He had built a trust instead of saying out loud, while he was living, the things that were hard to say in a house where someone else controlled the temperature of every conversation. He had built it the way he built everything, carefully, on a true foundation, with an eye toward what would last. The letter was the declaration. The trust was the proof that the declaration was real. My mother had said, "Claire has always been provided for." She had meant it as a dismissal. She had, without knowing it, told the most important truth of her life. Here is the only thing I want you to take from this story. Just one. The people who see you really see you, not the version of you that's convenient or useful or easiest to manage. Those people are doing something rare. They don't always say it in the moment. They don't always say it in the way you need, at the time you need it, in the room where it would matter most. Sometimes they say it in a letter that takes 11 years to arrive. But they say it. And when the record finally reaches you, even if it comes after every confrontation you imagined, and every room you thought it would change, and every moment where it might have been different, it still counts. The record still stands. My father saw me. He put it in writing. He made sure it would last. The rest is just math. And I have always been very good at math. That's my story. A will with 7 words, a trust that waited 11 years, and a letter that changed everything I thought I knew about both. If this reminded you to check who in your life is quietly paying attention, take that as your sign and do it today. If you know someone who has been made to feel like the invisible one in their own family, share this with them. Drop a comment. Hit subscribe. I'll see you in the next one.